So the subject is important forms of government discussed by Shri Prout Sarkar. So welcome to you all. Shri Sarkar discusses a number of forms of government. In this presentation, we discuss 5. The presentation is divided into 3 sections. First section provides some background and then discusses the first 3 forms: contemporary democracy, reform democracy, and a world government. I've scheduled in discussion break there to break it up. Next is the social cycle and post-capitalist martial eras, again followed by a discussion break. The social cycle will be explained at the start of this section. And the third section discusses the notion of the age of transition, spirituality, and the author's ideal system of government, which consists of boards of spiritually enlightened and experienced administrators. So there's a fair bit of content, but hopefully we'll be able to get through it. Just in case you're all not aware, Shri Sarkar was born in Jamalpur in India and lived most of his life in Bihar and West Bengal. Composed over 5,000 songs and founded about 50 organizations, and he died in 1990. In 1959, he created new socioeconomic theory, which he called progressive utilization theory, and as an acronym, it's Prout. In the late 1980s, he started publishing all his socioeconomic discourses into one series, Prout in a Nutshell, and the second edition of that work was published in 4 volumes in 2020 and contains some 185 chapters. The ideas from this presentation are taken from this series. So throughout, generally I refer to Shri Sarkar as the author for simplicity. So some basic definitions to start. Generally, we can say the word government means a group of people with the authority to govern a country or state. This is a general, simple definition. You can see if we unpack it, it has some specific features. A group of people who govern, they have prescribed authority or power. The power extends over the governed. Those governed accept, whether they like it or not, the authority of the group in government, and the authority to govern is limited to a country or political entity. Essentially, the idea of government defines a political relationship between the governed and those who are governed. Now, nowadays, of course, the authority to govern is generally devised from people in general and a section of them in a given country, and also a constitution. Now, briefly, a constitution can be defined as a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a country or state is acknowledged to be governed. In other words, it's a codified system of rules and regulations that govern the country. The constitution can be written or unwritten. These days, it's generally written. UK, perhaps a notable exception, it has an unwritten constitution that includes documents that stretch back some 1,000 years. Now, the first section, first 3 forms of government, we start off with contemporary democracy. Many of you will be familiar with this form of government, so we can just touch on some key points. This form of government, really, contemporary democracy, is about 3,500 years old. 350 years old. Democracy in general is about 2,500 years old. In 1850, Theodore Parker defined democracy as government of all people, by all people, and for all people. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln also said, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people should not perish from the earth. So this is a generally accepted definition of democracy. Although the author used this definition, he criticized it, and as we'll see, he also satirized it. For example, on one occasion he said, democracy is a government of the party, by the party, and for the party. On another occasion he said, democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but in fact government of the majority, so he called it mobocracy. And on a third occasion, noting the high number of uneducated and uninformed voters in many democracies, and expressing his general disdain for politicians, he said democracy is a government of fools, by fools, and for fools, and described it as a foolocracy. So this gives us a flavour, a sense of the author's opinion of democracy. But nevertheless, he accepted that it is a preferred system of government at the present time, and it's generally better than monarchies or individual dictatorships, and accords people various freedoms and human rights. He described it as the best system of a bad lot, and considered a better system would be developed in the future. So we can discuss contemporary democracy in a number of ways, including from the viewpoints of history, principles, theory, different types, and practice. And most of you will be familiar with contemporary democracy. So for our purposes, it's sufficient to mention the main characteristics. Now, these characteristics are collected from a variety of sources, some from the author and some from others, but they'll give you a sense of the main features or characteristics in democracy. So we can quickly go through them. There's citizen participation, consent of the government, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, property rights, voting rights, freedom from unwanted governmental imposition, citizenship, minority rights, elected representatives, multiple political parties, political tolerance, rule of law, respect for basic human rights, distinct branches of government, the separation of powers among the branches of government, free and fair elections, representation, and a written or unwritten constitution. So these are key features of contemporary democracy. So to conclude, in contemporary democracy, political parties, political leaders are politicians, and they attain power through participation in a political party. Some of the most important features of contemporary democracy are representation, various rights and freedoms enjoyed by citizens, three branches of government, the separation of powers, the rule of law, and a constitution. Now, the second type of government we'll discuss is reform democracy. The author also uses the term restricted democracy to discuss this type of system, and that'll become clear. The reason for that will become clear in a moment. So based on his comments, the author mentioned about contemporary democracy. It's clear that he considers contemporary democracy is in need of reform. And below, some of his recommended reforms are set out. The problems and both the reform are mentioned. First, some candidates are declared elected without having an election contest. The reform should be that no candidate should be declared elected without a contest. Second, in some cases, there is only one candidate. The reform is that in such cases, the popularity of the candidate must be tested, such that votes are cast for or against the candidate. If the candidate fails to secure a majority of favourable votes, they should not be elected. The third issue is that in some cases, rich and influential people can compel candidates by financial inducements or intimidation to withdraw their nomination. The reform is that if a candidate or their supporters are found guilty of such activity, they should be debarred from participating in the election or prosecuted. The fourth is that many candidates standing for election do not have clear or comprehensive policies, or say one thing during an election campaign and do another once elected. The reform is that every candidate should be required to publish their policies well before the election. That is, candidates should sign an electoral contract setting out their policies before they are allowed to participate in an election. After the election, if it is found that the elected candidate is acting against their declared policies, such as by their voting record or public statements, and this is proved in a court of law, their election should be cancelled and they should be debarred from holding office. This is an important idea, and it's really an extension of contract law that exists in many countries in the world today. The fifth one is that if in elections, voters generally have to be of a certain age, such as 18, to participate. Generally speaking, the author doesn't support age restrictions for participating in elections. Those younger than the prescribed age should be permitted to participate, providing they have the required competence. Number 6, in many countries, uneducated and less educated people who lack discrimination and social and economic political consciousness have the right to vote. The reform is ensure that those who vote have the requisite ethical insight, education, and social, economic, and political consciousness to be informed voters. In practice, this reform would require creating an electoral college of aware and informed voters for election purposes. And we'll say more about this in a few moments. Number 7, politicians like to poke their noses into the education system in an attempt to make it fertile ground for their political ideologies. The reform is that politicians should have no right to involve themselves in the education system, which should be run by highly regarded educators. Number 8, politicians also poke their noses into the branches of government for political purposes. The reform is to ensure the branches of government, as far as possible, are separate and independent. And the final one is that the accounts of the branches of government are not properly audited, or if they are, little or nothing is done if inconsistencies or corruption is uncovered. The reform is to make the audit function of an administration a separate branch of government, increasing the number of branches from 3, the legislature, executive, and judiciary, to 4, to include the audit branch. Further, the audit branch should be empowered to fearlessly audit the accounts of the other 3 branches. So these are some of the numerous reforms that the author suggests. There are a couple of other important reforms that are generally advocated by advocates of democratic reform. The first deals with the pervasive influence of money in democracy. The reform is generally the advocation, the suggestion that public funds, public funding of election should be proposed as a means of reducing the influence of money in politics. In other words, the government, the state allocates funds for election purposes, and to a large extent, private funds are not permitted to be part of elections. The second one is that the power of vested interests to influence policy and legislation for their own benefit rather than the benefit of society as a whole. The reform is to require all submissions to government to be in comprehensive written form and open to public scrutiny. Further, require all government contracts to proceed through a transparent public tender process and open to public scrutiny with no or minimal commercial in confidence provisions. The third one is gerrymandering, or as it's often known in the US, redistricting. The boundaries of election districts should be set by an impartial statutory authority, such as an electoral commission, with no involvement by politicians, political parties, or the executive. So these are a number of problems and reforms. Now we'll just focus on 3 important ones that really get to the heart of reforming democracy. The first is the creation of an electoral college of educated, ethical, and socially, economically, and politically aware voters. This really comes out of one of the author's early discourses, and it provides the basis of his recommended forms of democracy. This reform is essential to transform democracy and raise the general standard of political leadership and political discourse. It's important to note that by electoral college here, we simply mean a body of voters who formally cast their votes in an election. It does not refer to the US electoral college system. The electoral college would be overseen by an independent election Commission structured as a statutory authority. In other words, there'd be laws passed by the government that would empower the Electoral Commission to supervise elections and the electoral college. Now, we can surmise that if an election college was established, we would expect the Election Commission to set out the standard required for those seeking to become members of the Electoral College, assess the standard of the applicants, from time to time raise the required standard, disqualify members who no longer meet the prescribed standard, and require that the members follow the system of compulsory voting. In other words, if you're a member of the Electoral College, you should have to vote. You may be able to register an informal vote, but you cannot abstain or not vote. The second one is that the creation of a fourth branch of government. The author recommends that the audit functions of government should be transformed into a fourth branch of government, the audit branch. The audit branch should have the power to fearlessly check the accounts of the other three branches and be headed by the Auditor General. The audit branch should probably also have the power to recommend or even initiate criminal proceedings against any government official who it finds engaged in corrupt activity. This recommendation is quite an important one. As far as I'm aware, no government in the world today has created a fourth branch of government. Nearly all governments have an audit department or an audit section, sometimes in the executive branch, but no government has actually created a fourth branch of government and resourced it and empowered it and given it the authority to check the other three branches fearlessly. We can imagine that should this reform be implemented, it would have an immediate effect on elevating the ethical standards of democracy. And the third one is strict separation of powers. Each of the four branches should be separate and independent, and no branch would be under the other. In practice, of course, administrative efficiency requires the four branches to cooperate closely. But in many democracies today, the president, prime minister, or cabinet ministers meddle in the affairs of the bureaucracy or judiciary for political purposes. As far as possible, this tendency should be eliminated. So in conclusion, in a reformed democracy, the author suggests candidates for political office would need to be ethical, educated, and socially, economically, and politically aware. They would attain power through participation in an electoral college, so we would expect political parties to have significantly less influence than they do today. Now, the third area, before we have a break, the third type of government to discuss is the world government. So basic structure and function as suggested by the author are as follows. Two houses of parliament, an upper house and a lower house. The lower house, the members elected based on population. The upper house, the members elected country-wise. An implication of this system is that countries with a small population who are unable to send representatives to the lower house would still have representation in the world government in the upper house. A world militia, replacing the need for armies in each country. A world police force. A world constitution. The constitution and legal framework of the world government would have to be accepted by all the countries of the world. The world government would include a Bill of Rights, which should include the following: complete security should be guaranteed to all the plants and animals on the planet. Each country should guarantee purchasing power to its citizens. The Constitution should guarantee 4 fundamental rights, including spiritual practice, cultural legacy, education, and indigenous linguistic expression. And cardinal human values should take precedence over all other rights. Cardinal human values are very important. Cardinal human values mean cardinal human principles and in essence refer to the principles of spiritual morality. As far as possible, the author recommends that these principles of spiritual morality should be expressed in government policy, and he calls this cardinal law. This is the area where ethics and law coincide and get expressed in the laws of a country, particularly a world government. Very important for the future of a healthy society. The eighth point is the establishment of common penal code throughout the world. Number 9 is the constitution of the world government should be written and should be drafted by the world government sitting as a constitution assembly. Alternatively, the UN could be transformed into a world government. Number 10, management of industrial, agricultural, trade and commercial enterprises should not be in the hands of the world government. Ideally, they should be in the hands of socioeconomic units and federations of socioeconomic units. Initially, the world government should function as a law framing body and have the right to make decisions regarding the application or non-application of any law for a limited period in any country. In this phase, the governments of the different countries would have only administrative power. They would not have the authority to frame laws, but they would be able to decide when to implement the laws framed by the world government within a prescribed time frame. These 2 points are very important because they set out a transitional period that we suggest could last for many decades before the world government is fully established. So the transitional period would be the period in which the legal framework of the world government and the world police force is accepted by all countries, and the laws that are implemented are accepted by the various countries, and the penal code is accepted so to such a stage where all the governments are then aligned with the constitutional framework of the world government. So this transitional phase could take some time. The author calls this the initial stage of establishing the world government. Number 13, the author is also of the opinion that with advances in technology, the mastery of human beings over space and time will continue to increase. Hence, the necessity of a world government will be profoundly felt. Now, this is interesting because it indicates that the aspiration to create a world government will come out of the feeling of human beings, and they'll feel that increasingly as a necessity. It's not going to be something that's going to be imposed. At present time, English should be accepted as the world government, but in future this will change. If the world government is established in the near future, it should establish socioeconomic units throughout the world. The boundaries can be adjusted and the units can merge together if certain conditions are met, such as economic parity, cultural mixing, administrative efficiency, and cultural communication facilities. Number 16, the boundaries of the world government should go on increasing, such that it should include the administrations of other planets as human beings settle the solar system. So last section is, how might world government be formed? There's a number of ways. If we look historically, the League of Nations was emerged after the First World War, United Nations after the Second World War. If there is another world war or regional wars in the near medium term, it could result in the formation of a world government. Another option is the UN could transform itself into a world government. The UN already has a court system, engages in peacekeeping operations, has a general assembly and supports human rights. So the foundation for world government already exists within the UN. Changing environmental and political circumstances on the planet could compel greater cooperation and coordination among countries for the survival of humanity. Global warming and climate change might provide the requisite impetus to create a world government. The author also suggests that in due course, the world government will function as a confederation of federations. And he gives some scenarios that are briefly outlined in the text on how this might happen. So finally, the author considers that the greatest obstacle today to the formation of a world government is the political ambitions of national leaders. The power they have today on the national level would greatly diminish in a world government. So in conclusion, if a world government is formed in the near future, the world government most likely would consist of politicians who are also members of a political party in their respective countries. However, as members of a world government, they would be expected to function as internationalists with a cosmopolitan outlook. Considering the welfare of humanity as a whole, if the world government is formed after significant democratic reforms have been implemented, we would expect the influence of political parties to diminish. So perhaps now we can have a discussion break if anyone would like to contribute anything, and then we'll continue on with the next section.
Thank you very much, Jayanta. That was fantastic. So I'm just taking some questions from the chat. We have here, can you comment on what might be the criteria for being registered as a voter in the Electoral College, and how would you see that being implemented?
Really good question. The guidelines the author gives is that voters should be educated, they should be ethical, and they should have social, economic, and political consciousness. Now the question arises, how does that translate into a requirement that people can fulfill to become members of the Electoral College? And people have suggested a number of things. Maybe we look at people's education, although the author also suggests that formal academic or schooling education shouldn't be the only way to assess education. So education has to be interpreted in the broader sense. Ethical standard, that's quite an interesting one. How do we assess people's ethical standard? And also social, economic, and political consciousness. Is there a test? Is there some general knowledge requirement? These issues presumably would be taken up by the Electoral Commission and codified. Now, they might have a test, something along the lines of a driving test where people have to qualify. There may be a theoretical component. There may be a practical component. There may be certain requirements people have to fulfill in their life. For example, show that they're involved in social service activities or doing some sort of public welfare. There's a range of ways that this may be assessed. Ultimately, it's going to be up to, I imagine, the Electoral Commission to work out a standard. Once a standard is worked out, we would expect that that standard from time to time would be gradually increased to increase the general standard in society. Now, a rule of thumb could be applied to this. Generally, we find today that in countries that have voluntary voting, less than 50% of eligible voters is considered a low voter turnout. If more than 50% vote, generally it's considered a good turnout. Now, we would want sufficient people to be members of the Electoral College so that there are sufficient voters to give credence and justification to those elected. You wouldn't want to have an Electoral College that has a tiny percentage of people and then the leaders come from that tiny percentage of people. That wouldn't make much sense. So I would imagine that the Electoral Commission would want to try and get about, say, 40 to 50% of those who are eligible to vote in current systems to be members of the Electoral College. As a rule of thumb, that may give us an idea of how the electoral college system could work. Any other suggestions or comments? If not, we'll continue on.
Yes, sorry about that. My mic was turned off. There's a question here asking whether this information, these reforms of government and administration have been suggested to any governments or institutions.
Some of them are well known. A number of the reforms come from the author's early writings, and for example, in India are well known. A number of the other reforms that I mentioned, particularly about financial reform and the role of interest groups, are also well known and have definitely been mentioned to government from time to time, but as understandably perhaps have not been taken up by government. As a general rule, politicians like maximum flexibility, especially when it comes to their power and influence. It's very difficult as a general rule to expect politicians to censor themselves or to introduce reforms that restrict their activities. It's hard to imagine a lot of these reforms coming about by politicians themselves. I would imagine that many of these reforms would have to come about through quite significant public agitation and pressure on government. As far as electoral contracts go, really, if some powerful interest group took a case to a court and claimed that a politician's election manifesto was in fact a contract and challenged it under contract law, it would be very interesting to see what the outcome would be. This may be a way of challenging that particular reform, and if that was successful, that may create a precedence. So there are different ways in which some of these reforms could come about. But
great, thank you.
General expectation is that it will require a fair bit of pressure.
Okay, so these recommendations aren't necessarily going to come from the World Economic Forum, perhaps?
I don't think so.
Where can we find this information?
Generally, most of the reforms that were suggested in the writings of the author, if you scan through, it takes a bit of research to find the passages, put them all together. There's a huge amount of literature available on democracy online. There's literally hundreds and hundreds of books. If you Google democratic reforms, for example, or financial reforms in democracy, or any of these other topics, you'll come across heaps of information. If you're interested in the history of democracy, for example, on Wikipedia, there's a very good page, History of Democracy, that lists out chronologically the whole history of democracy and gives dates. So that may be a good starting point for some people, for those of you interested in research.
That's great. And is that to say that the ideas expressed by Sri Sarkar could have been picked up by other people also?
Certainly. The idea of a fourth branch of government has also been around for a long time. I'm not sure if the author was the first person to propose this. I suspect he wasn't. It's probably been around for many, many decades. But again, governments, as a general rule, particularly the executive, it doesn't like this reform because it's really going to expose their corruption. So I would imagine that quite stringent pressure, quite tough pressure would be required to introduce this reform.
Thank you. We have another question. It's asking, could we possibly have a copy of this document that you're reading from?
Yes, I can make it available. Happy to make it available. This is a shorter version. I have a slightly longer version. I can finish editing it in a day or two, and I can send it to you, and you can circulate it.
Thank you very much. The next point, should the voters pass an examination and get an accreditation for passing that, such as a driver's license?
My personal opinion, this is just a personal opinion, I imagine that the Electoral Commission will have to have some theoretical and practical test, something like a driver's license. Now, that may not be the full component, but I imagine it would be part of it. It's a very simple and easy way to test people. A driver's license these days often has a theoretical and practical component. I imagine something similar would be an easy way to start. There may be other ways as well, but ultimately it's going to be up to the Electoral Commission to work this out.
Thank you. The next question is saying it depends on who is running the world government. They must be absolutely benevolent, selfless people looking out for the welfare of others. How to create such types of people?
Look, it's a good question. If the world government gets created, say tomorrow, if there's the political will and the world government gets created in the next 5 years, we would expect that politicians, professional politicians from political parties would be elected from various countries and would go to the world government. In other words, the world government would be consist of politicians. On the other hand, if the world government was created in 50 or 100 years, and by that time substantial democratic reforms have been implemented, and we have a system of an electoral college of educated and ethical voters, we would expect that in that scenario, people of a slightly higher quality and caliber would be elected to the world government. So time, place, person adjustment. We're talking about different eras and different possibilities. But it's also true to say that many people in the world government today are quite outstanding people. They're highly educated, they're very broad-minded, many of them have universal aspirations, they strongly support human rights. Of course, some are politicians, but many are very broad-minded diplomats. Many of them are experts in various areas of government. So as a general rule, you find a high quality, a high caliber of people in the world, in the UN. So it's quite possible that we could make the transition from the UN to a world government and see high quality people functioning in the world government.
Can I ask a question regarding whether reforms to the existing political and administrative systems is to be encouraged from a Proutist perspective, which seems to be going for a much bigger, all-comprehensive system change?
Look, it's a good question. My reading of the author's work is that he took a multidimensional approach. He advocated reforms, as we can see from his writings. There's many reforms he advocates for democracy. He advocates evolution, bringing pressure up to bear. He advocates creating grassroots movements, social movements, forming socioeconomic zones. He advocates forming a world government on the world stage. He, in certain circumstances, advocated social revolution. So it's multidimensional. He advocated developing our spirituality and disseminating spirituality. He established a variety of organizations that covered all manner of human endeavor, from the physical through to the spiritual. It seems to me it's not an either or when we're talking about social change. It's more time, place, person adjustment, and it's particularly looking at social context and looking at what people are inspired to do and what's appropriate for the social context.
Excellent. The next question. What is the expected transition period for local government to transition to fully fledged government with all four tiers or branches?
Look, this is a really interesting question. If we take the bottom-up approach and say that at some point in the future, socioeconomic units will create their own leadership, and then socioeconomic units in a country will come together and create leadership on the federation level, and that this is replicated throughout the world, and then all the federations come together and create a confederation, and this confederation is the world government. This process is going to take a long time. Now, if you look at what the author said about the world government, he also empowered the world government to create socioeconomic units. So he took both approaches. He took a top-down approach by looking at the world government, empowering it to create socioeconomic units. And he also took a bottom-up approach by encouraging socioeconomic units to be formed, encouraging them to form federations, and ultimately then to create a confederation, if a world government is already formed, to influence and transform the world government by pressure from the federations. So my understanding of this is that he took both approaches. It's not an either or, as suggested before.
Thank you. Who would establish an electoral commission and be members of it? Would they also vet candidates for office? And what additional requirements might they have to meet beyond being eligible to be voters?
The Electoral Commission in many countries is already established by statute. In other words, there are laws covering it. In Australia today, an election is going on, and the Electoral Commission steps in as soon as an election is called and takes over the checking of candidates to make sure everything is up to order and they are fulfilling the requirements. It prepares the ballot. It sets out the election booths. It supervises the elections. It scrutineers all the ballots and ultimately declares who the election winner is. So this happens as a matter of law and statute, and the running of government becomes suspended during this process. So in many countries, a similar process works. An election commission is empowered by law to do these functions, to make sure that elections are free and fair. Now, it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that the Electoral Commission could also have the power to establish and oversee an electoral college. It's really a matter of passing a few laws to make this happen. It's not a big legal issue. Once the laws are established and procedures are put in place to make it happen, the main challenge probably would be what is the appropriate standard, how to set the standard, how to encourage people to become members of the Electoral College. Once that is done, the normal election procedures kick in. So if we think about this issue practically, not a great deal has to happen to introduce this reform. It's really legislation and then administrative.
Thank you. The next point is a suggestion that your text gets made into a booklet as a guideline. Next question. We have tomorrow, if we have tomorrow a Proutist political party established within one of the existing democracies, what would you say would be their first priority?
Look, the first challenge of a Prout political party is to develop an election platform that appeals to a large section of the population to get sufficient votes to get elected. In other words, the purpose of a Prout political party is to get sufficient votes to get elected. An alternative strategy is to be a pressure group to try and bring about change simply by participating in the electoral process. Both approaches can be used. If we go back to the 60s, there were certain people in India who were very senior, who the author recommended should be candidates. And a couple of them were elected to government. And the author himself gave suggested policy proposals to those candidates, who then put them up in government and discussed them with other government ministers and with other representatives. And through this way, people in government got to know of the ideas of the author. So this is one avenue. The other avenue is to see a political party as, if you like, a pressure group, to put ideas out into the public and to change public perception.
Thank you very much. Okay, the next question here is regarding political parties in the Proutist system. Do political parties exist? If they do their powers get curtailed in some way?
Look, if we look at the history, the author created the Proutist Bloc of India in 1968. And the Proutist Bloc of India was intended to stand for elections, and it did that. By the time that the author came out of jail, he had established Proutist Universal. And in India, Proutist Universal replaced both the Proutist Forum of India and the Proutist Bloc of India. So the Proutist Bloc of India, the political party in India, only existed for about a decade. And then it was changed. Then it was shut down, if you will. It was transformed into Proutist Universal. And then soon after the author came out of jail, he established socioeconomic movements at the end of 1979. And then through socioeconomic units, through socioeconomic movements, he authorized some of those movements to stand candidates in elections. For example, Amar Bengali, the 5 socioeconomic movements in Bihar, a couple in Orissa, were all authorized to stand candidates in elections. And they did so. But in order to do so, they had to fulfill certain requirements. They couldn't just create something and then stand for an election. They had to have, for example, have newspapers. They had to have so many offices established. They had to have members. They had to have a whole series of requirements to prove that they were a strong, viable organization that had public support before they were given permission to stand candidates. So if you look at the history, it gives a very good insight into how to go about creating and putting up candidates from a broad Proutist platform. And in my opinion today, the same approach should be followed. It's better to set up a socioeconomic movement, a Samaj movement, if you will, a social movement, and then stand candidates from that platform. I frankly don't see much point in standing candidates from a general Prout platform.
Thank you very much indeed. Maybe that's something that could be taken on board by Proutist Universal today, in the light that there seemed to be a movement towards simply creating political parties, even practically without any membership, what to speak of other things that you noted there. Let's carry on. There's this is a sort of more general question, and maybe you want to continue on with your presentation, in which case we can hold off on that.
Look, I'm open to whatever people like to do. I'm happy to continue on. If people want to discuss, I don't mind.
Okay, I think it's a relevant question. It says, what actions should Proutists take today in the present situation if it's believed that a powerful elite were transitioning in a way where human rights and well-being and freedom may be strongly curtailed?
Look, this is a really interesting question, and I expect some of this discussion will be covered by the next section. So let's use that question as a segue into the next section about the social cycle and martial governments. Would that be okay?
Great, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so let's talk about the social cycle. to start off the next section. In case some of you are not aware, the author set out a model of social change that he described as the social cycle. And this is a cyclic movement of society through different eras, each dominated by a different social class. The cycle repeats itself, but the form of subsequent class-based eras also varies from previous eras. The cycle moves from the worker era to the martial era, to the intellectual era, to the capitalist era. The capitalist era then ends, completing a rotation of the social cycle, and a new martial era begins, starting the next rotation. Now, progress can take place through natural change, evolution, or revolution, but the cycle can also regress for periods of time through counter-evolution and counter-revolution. So that's the broad picture of the social cycle. So leaders in each era of the social cycle develop systems of government that best suit their needs, and some features of the system developed in one era may be retained in a subsequent era. So this is important. Monarchy, for example, is a characteristic of the martial era, but some countries today, notably England, still has a monarchy. So the monarchy has, in the case of England, has gone from a martial era through an intellectual era and has survived well into a capitalist era. Today, countries in the Western world are said to be in the capitalist era, and the social cycle predicts that in due course, this era will end and these countries will move into a post-capitalist martial era. This is an important point to understand. It becomes clear later on. Countries such as Russia and China are said to be in a post-capitalist martial era. So the social cycle describes the broad sweep of social movement dominated by a succession of social classes, has been characterized as a theory of macro history. The various forms of government discussed by the author, except his ideal system, have their roots in the different eras of the social cycle. As we shall see, the author's ideal system, in a sense, steps outside the 4 eras of the social cycle and is really situated in the center of the social cycle. And now let's take some concrete examples. This gets a little bit interesting and somewhat controversial. Russia, like China, is in a post-capitalist martial era. Russia had a communist revolution to overthrow the Tsar and feudalism about 100 years ago. And similarly, in China, communists defeated the nationalists about 70 years ago. Although both these countries experienced communist revolutions, communism is not a prerequisite for revolution. And today, we can see that communism is in nearly all countries, except perhaps China, has been consigned to history. In other words, the social cycle provides us with some insight into the behavior of martial leaders in a martial era, as it does with leaders in other eras. So it gives us some insight into possible scenarios and possible futures. Also, given that countries of Southern and Western Europe are in a capitalist era, their response to the invasion is characteristic of capitalist psychology. Avoid committing troops to the conflict, provide weapons, use economic sanctions, and protect their own economies. In other words, as far as possible, try and continue with business as usual. Now, let me just explain this scenario in more visual language so people can grasp it. If we take this analysis a step further, the Russian portion of Europe, that is Russia to the west of the Ural Mountains, and the capitalist portion of Europe, that is the countries in the western and southern part of Europe, can be likened to 2 tectonic plates colliding along the fault line of Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, and Ukraine, with several of these states being formerly part of the Soviet Union. Each state is in a different era of the social cycle, and each has a different collective psychology. Consequently, conflict and military hostilities between the two should not come as a surprise. In other words, if we apply the social cycle and look at Europe and see that there are two different collective psychologies in Europe existing simultaneously, and there's a fault line down the middle of Europe, naturally there will be conflict. Naturally, there'll be military hostilities. This would seem to me to be a logical interpretation of the social cycle. Dictatorial government perhaps provides a glimpse of a possible future for European democracies when they move into a post-capitalist martial era, assuming the social cycle continues to move according to its natural rotation. So this may be controversial for some people, but it seems to me this is the logic inherent in the social cycle. Europe and Western democracies are in capitalist eras. In due course, they will move into post-capitalist martial eras. And in those eras, they will have to decide what type of governments they have. And given the martial psychology, it would not come as a surprise as some of those governments had martial dictatorships. Now, the same basic scenario can be applied to China and East Asia. You can read through it if you like there. The same scenario is sort of a parallel scenario is set out for China and Taiwan and the capitalist countries in Asia. The conclusion is that martial governments tend to favor dictatorship, and martial dictators in the right circumstances tend to have little hesitation in using military force to further their own objectives. As mentioned, this tendency is also a characteristic of superpowers. As a general rule, we could say a martial dictator does not fear workers, intellectuals, or capitalists, or indeed other less powerful martial leaders. A martial leader only fears a more powerful martial adversary. So that completes the second session.
Okay, can we open it up to the questions? And we're actually down to the last 4 minutes. How long do you think the martial eras will prevail? Could this be for a short amount of time before it transitions to the next stage of the social cycle?
The short answer is no. Eras in the social cycle last many centuries. They don't last a few decades or even a century or two. We've just completed 5,000 years of human history, 15,000 years of human history, and we've only completed one rotation of the social cycle. Only really two countries have moved into a post-capitalist martial era. That's really Russia and China. So, 15,000 years is a long time for the first rotation of the social cycle. Now, the second rotation of the social cycle will take a shorter period of time, but we could expect an era in the next rotation to last 500-600 years. Who knows? These sorts of changes in a social context, they go on for a long time.
I'm asking another question. What is the role of Prout in the coming post-capitalist, post-revolution new martial government?
Look, this is a really interesting question, and it requires some preparation and discussion. It's probably not appropriate to go into it here, but the short answer is Prout is an ideology. It's a set of ideas, and also there are many things in Prout that can be applied, some policies which are applied Prout. So when we say what's the role of Prout, Prout's an ideology. We have to look at the era, the psychology, the people, the circumstances, and apply it in that context. So Prout can be applied in any era, in any set of circumstances, but we really need to define carefully what we're talking about to really have a meaningful discussion.
Next question. Could a martial leader like Putin be guided to form a benevolent society in the way PR Sarkar recommends?
Really good question. Short answer is yes. Uh, the idea is that in the martial era, you can have benevolent martial dictators. You can also have malevolent martial dictators. Examples that the author give are Chandragupta in the Gupta age in India. The Gupta age in India was considered the golden age in Indian history, and Chandragupta is revered as a very great martial leader who did a great deal of good, and Baba praises him for being a very good monarch. And there are many others that were also good. He gives also the example of Akbar. Akbar was a very strong leader, and he was quite cosmopolitan and broad-minded. Brother Baba has some respect for his administrative abilities as well. So they are two good examples of benevolent, competent martial leaders in martial eras.
Thank you so much. We've run out of time, so I think we're going to have to leave it at that. But I would suggest we set up another occasion for the continuation of your presentation and for exploring these further questions.
Yes, I'm happy to do that, no problem. Thank you everyone for participating.